Next outside, sliding back. Open the windows. We have 62. Now open the windows.
Glasses to read so I can see. How you guys? Did you see the game?
I know, isn't that the truth? And also, you know,
Here comes Colorado.
I like
it just makes it easier. It's me, it's just a game. We're all having fun.
it's not like the last 6 weeks I've lost power. So if I lose power, even though I have a generator, so I can make it even higher. So I get the satellite pods, if I have that power. Even the power's down. When the power's down, I probably have the power's down. That's where it comes from. As long as they keep the title,
Watch out, somebody else on the front row.
You grab yourself in? I did, yes, thank you. Told Gary to bring it up. Because I needed the extra time.
There's room in the front row. You don't have to sit in the way back if you don't want to. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. We are continuing our Bible study on Dr. Tim Keller's book, The Reason for God. And we're on the third session today, which some people talk about, if they're skeptics, they would talk about theism's largest problem. They use the word theism to say anybody who believes in some kind of a higher power. And they would say one of the theism's greatest problem is this. The fact of appalling evil and suffering in the world is one of the main reasons they cannot believe in the traditional God of the Bible. Because the God of the Bible is portrayed as a God who's both all-powerful and all-good. And if that God exists, he would not create a world filled with pointless evil. Yet the world is filled with pointless evil. Therefore, the God of the Bible cannot exist. This is an argument that people have been making for a very long time. One of the stories that I one time included in the paper I wrote was about the great man of German letters, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. So if you know anything about German literature, Goethe is kind of at the top of the list. He also happens to be featured prominently on the label of my favorite beer. It's the dark beer with a blonde soul, and there's Goethe right on there drinking some of it. But Goethe was a man who his influence on German culture could hardly be overstated. I love the account of when Napoleon met Goethe. Napoleon, this is the guy, of course, who conquered pretty much all of Europe and turned it into his personal fief. And he left the meeting with Goethe, and Napoleon said, forgive my French, but he said, voilà un homme. He goes, that is a man. Right? So this is the Goethe that we're talking about. And he was born a Lutheran. Born a Lutheran, raised in a Lutheran family. But he was shaken by the very same question that we just read here. In fact, the issue for him, Goethe saw Europe embroiled in the 7 Years' War, and then ultimately for him it happened on All Saints' Day, November 1st, 1755, at 9:40 in the morning, when there was a huge earthquake near Lisbon, Portugal, that was estimated by researchers today at we call it 8.5 or 9 on the Richter scale. Yeah, huge. The earthquakes, the fires, and the tsunami were estimated to kill 100,000. Goethe could not answer the question, If God is good, well, then he's not in control. Or if God's in control, well, then he's certainly not good. Because he couldn't answer that question, this Lutheran man rejected his faith, and he used to refer to himself as Der große Heide, the great heathen. Right? So the point of this question is a really important one that has been impacting people for a long time. So what we're doing again is we're following the leap of doubt, as you can see on the questions on the right at the top of your handout. Dr. Keller is inviting us to scratch at the doubts in our faith for two reasons. One of which, so that we can find answers to those things that maybe we've doubted, and then those answers can serve as like antibodies in our faith to deal with objections that come up. And also he suggests that we do that so we can find common ground with skeptics, people whose doubts make them wonder if the God of the Bible can be true. If we are able to scratch the itch of our own doubts, he suggests maybe we'll find ourselves more able to understand where someone's coming from who has doubts of their own. So that's what we're going to take a look at today. If you want to post questions, oops, I'm sorry. I don't know why I can't make this work. If you want to post questions, you can do so again on that on the poll EV that's on your sheet, one of the three ways. Vicar will be monitoring those questions. You certainly can just raise your hand and ask questions too, but if you feel like you're in the back and you don't want to yell, you can do that and Vicar will yell for you. So this question about evil and suffering has been around for a very long time. The quote that I'm bringing here is from 270 BC. People have been asking this question ever since there was evil and suffering in the world. But Epicurus is, if you remember your Greek philosophy, there were two schools, the Stoics and the Epicureans. The founder of Epicureanism, Epicurus, he wrote this question down below. If God is willing to prevent evil, but not able, well, then he's not all-powerful. If God is able to prevent evil, but not willing, then he's not good. If he's both willing and able, then how can evil exist? If he is neither able nor willing, then why call him God? Today we're going to examine what's called a theodicy. A theodicy is an explanation for how evil and suffering can exist with an all-powerful God. The word theodicy, you see the word for theo in there, that's a word for God, like theology. And the D-I-C or D-I-K part is like the word we get for justification, dikaiao. So in one sense, a theodicy is justifying God, saying there's a reason for this. And the answer, the theodicy that we're going to take a look at, is going to center ourselves in these questions. But let's take a look at Epicurus. And one of the things when we take a look at this question, we have to understand some of the assumptions that are made if you follow Epicurus or Goethe or any of the other people that have asked this question and then renounced their faith. What are some of the assumptions that we could maybe write down that Epicurus et al. would say? I've come up with 7. Let's see how many we get. Please.
Well, you wouldn't be able to believe in any religion because obviously none of those religions or gods have been able to stop the evil.
Okay, you couldn't believe in any religion because none of their gods can also stop the evil. Joshua, then Robert?
That God logic is the same as human logic.
Okay, that God logic is the same as human logic? Robert, and then Mike?
The nature of what evil is suffering actually evil? Is cancer actually evil? Is when you stub your toe actually evil? If we can't separate, or if we can separate them, then those things no longer become evil. They just become existing.
Okay, what actually is evil? Is it evil because you perceive it to be such? Some people who talk about this, they make a distinction between types of evil, and I think I asked that question out here, didn't I? What kind of evils are there in the world? I can think of maybe 3 things, broad categories that we would call evil. Bad. That's an obscure question. So I can just tell you, Keller.
Natural disaster.
Okay, natural disaster like an earthquake or like the tsunami that happened with the earthquake and it killed 100,000 people. We would call that disastrous, calamitous, bad. Another kind of evil would be,
Sickness.
okay, sickness, yeah, the things that happen to us because we live in a broken world. Another one.
War.
Okay, moral choices, right? That man is evil, makes evil choices, hurts people, steals, whatever. And then maybe the last one would be the one Robert mentioned there, which is I stub my toe, if I fall down and I hurt my knee on the ground. A lot of times philosophers will cross that last one out and say, that's not evil, that's just a consequence of you falling. But the first ones we have to account for. Right? We have to account for what evil is. And I think Robert's point that we're going to make a little bit later too is evil objectively, or is evil because I perceive it that way? Right, good, Mike.
Okay, so this worldview doesn't account for free will at all.
Okay, it doesn't account for free will. In what way do you mean that?
Because if God were playing a chess game and controlling every movement, then we really have no choice over our lives, whether to follow good or evil.
Okay, that's actually one theodicy people make, which is to say God created creatures with free will, and that was there in no way would God's glory or creation be what it is if God had created us as spiritual automatons or robots, and free will therefore puts all the evil onto mankind. That's one theodicy, yeah, definitely. What another assumption people make with this high.
Are we distinguishing between garden variety sin, wickedness, and evil? Because it seems like everything is getting all lumped into evil.
Well, what we're talking about, remember, is a view from a skeptic. So the skeptic is not as concerned about the fact that I'm selfish. He's more concerned about evil that happens. So I think that's why we're talking about it in that way. And I'm sorry, I should have repeated that question. She asked, are we talking about sin in general or evil things? And so trying to set the parameters there, please.
If we go through suffering, God doesn't love us.
Okay, there's a big assumption that if you're suffering, somehow that means God doesn't love you, right? Think about that assumption a little bit, that the assumption is that God's not doing anything or is not involved in this world at all. That's one assumption in this argument, right? That God's inactive, right? Good. Chris?
Or he's punishing.
Yeah, or he's punishing me. Yeah, that is unfortunately the thing that for us as Christians, we run to immediately when something bad happens in our life. We always try to establish causality, right? So something bad happened to me. If I got really sick, well, why is that? There has to be some reason. And the reason I come up with is God is finally getting even with me for that thing I did when I was 28. Right? We do it. We do that. Now, here's the best part. We'll hit this a couple of times on the way back through. How can we know for sure that that's not the case? That God is not punishing you if sickness comes in your life? Jamie Grace.
Because there are people who get away with stuff all the time.
Okay, there are people who get away with stuff all the time. Well, maybe God just really cares about you not getting away with it. Here's how you can know that God doesn't work that way. That God doesn't work on karma. If there was one man who ever lived that never got his karma wrong, it was Jesus. The one guy who never did anything wrong. And if God worked on that principle, then what should have happened to Jesus? Nothing but good. But instead, what you see is you see the absolute worst possible thing happening to the absolute best possible man. Right? There's no way God can work on the system of karma. And we're going to find out something about the crosses that we bear when we look at Jesus. And it gets back to maybe the thing Robert was bringing up. Is something bad objectively, or because I think it's bad? You know, Peter in today's gospel lesson thought about Jesus on the cross as being the worst possible thing. The Messiah dying on a cross. And objectively, when you look at Jesus on the cross, it looks like the worst possible thing. Here's the world's best man ever, and the worst possible thing has happened to him. The Son of God is being crucified as a sinner. But what's the reality behind that cross? God can take the worst possible thing in the world and make it the best possible thing for you and me. And so his point that he's going to make to us is, if God can do that with the cross borne by the Son of God, do you think it's possible, maybe, he could do that for you? And that maybe the crosses in my life are not a sign of God's displeasure, but a sign instead of what God is going to do through me and to me. Yeah. Mike?
Another assumption being made is that there's a universal good and evil.
That there is a universal good and evil is the assumption. Yes, I agree. And I think in this regard, philosophers, like I say, they don't get caught up in theological differences. They would just say, like, the Holocaust, everybody can agree that that's evil, right? An earthquake that kills 100,000 people, everybody can agree that that's evil, right?
Not everyone would agree. Those that feel that the earth has too much population.
Okay, that's true. That's a really interesting point. We're going to come back to that. He said not everybody would agree with that. There are people who feel that the earth has too much of a population, so 100,000 fewer is better. How is that a theodicy? That's interesting. I'm going to get to that in another point down below, but since we're here, we can talk about it. Number 4, evil and suffering isn't evidence against God. There's going to be a point where we're going to read some of those things. Think about this. Someone abandoning God doesn't solve the problem of evil, right? Because you can only make a claim for evil or good if you believe there's such a thing by which it can be judged, right? If purely we are nothing but apes that have stood upright and lost our tail, if we are nothing except an evolutionary accident, well, then nature's law written in red of tooth and fang should hold. Why in the world should you be bothered if one country invades another country? It's just what organisms do. Who are you to say it's wrong for someone to use a gun to steal somebody else's stuff? It's just survival of the fittest. I mean, if truly there is no reason, what reason can you come up with that would say, no, humanity has a dignity that is owed to it? And if I were on the other side, I'd say, says who? Says who? What do you believe that this particular hairless ape you think deserves dignity when all you've said is that the evolutionary world is written red in tooth and fang? In order to make that claim, you have to make a claim of faith. A faith that there is something that makes them different. What are you basing it on? Right? What are you basing it on? Here's some of the assumptions that I saw on this list. The assumption assumes that God's inactive. Argument assumes God's ignorance of what's going on. And the argument assumes eternal limitations on God based on evil in the present. And it also assumes the inability for God to work good from evil. And the argument that this world is all there is. And then finally, it argues and assumes an objective moral framework. In other words, humanity should have some dignity. It's not right for you to kill somebody. That's an assumed moral framework. What are you basing that on if you don't believe that God exists? Right. All right, let's take a look at the next page, page number 3. I want you to discuss this in small groups for about 5 minutes. Imagine this scenario. A friend comes to you upset because he or she has recently experienced some form of personal suffering, like the death of a loved one, and says, I can't believe in a God who would allow this to happen to me, who would allow this evil and suffering. All right, in your group, you're going to order the possible responses from most to least helpful and explain why. Ready, set, break.
Oh, yeah.
So this is the scenario.
Okay.
Probably
I can't believe in a God.
not done it. Everybody seems to be.
All of these scenarios.
Least helpful, most helpful, most helpful.
It's probably not very well.
That's a Bible verse.
That is true.
That's last right? don't know, it says like waiting for
I mean, you got the Bible.
Well, I just said they're already in the order. Yeah.
And if they're thinking this, they've already filled it.
I don't like it.
Okay, thank you.
I know, I guess.
At least not in this. Yeah. But that's not what you need to do right now. I think I would too.
Unless you know
But I
it.
generally go with God has a plan. Even second and I did on the plans, really. It's his plan, it's never my plan. I'm thinking
It's not always about me.
Whatever works.
I know. Yeah. It's a man has my read on a Kindle. Yeah. I read on a Kindle so I can make the book big.
Great question. I just got the word message. I didn't want you guys to do. Oh, so the show on your should show on yours.
I think that goes back to
They're all expounding the same propaganda.
Oh, back there for you, for you.
Well, there you go. He was on it.
Okay. All right, just ignore it for now.
Same thing. They're trying to sell that to
Yeah, they're probably not good either. Yeah, stay away from all that.
What have you guys decided? What's your order? How about anybody want to suggest one that they liked as first or last or anything like that? Linda? Letter B, gently with compassion, try to... D, listen to your friend without saying much in response. Good. Why did you like that one?
Because sometimes you just can't say the right thing, and sometimes it's just better, like, just to give them a hug.
Okay, she said sometimes you might not say the right thing, it's better just to give them a hug. Okay, anybody for a different one, please?
People have to feel understood before you can try to,
Okay, people have to feel understood before you can try to help them, yeah? Please.
Well, you'd have to know the person. I mean, if you're talking to a Christian friend, you could maybe say something like, but if it's not a Christian,
Okay.
you're obviously not going to say.
Joanne said, if they're a Christian, maybe you can say A. If they're not a Christian, you obviously wouldn't want to start with that. Thoughts to that? I want to read you something from a paper I wrote on this that was, I think has been important for me in my development, and so I was sharing this with a group of pastors in training at the seminary. Oops, I had this in the right place, now I gotta keep going. And I'm almost there. When a faithful member of the congregation suddenly has a new cross in their life, ministering to them can be a challenge for their pastor. It's a narrow road of counseling with God's word we are to walk, and the ditches on either side are deep. If we fall into one ditch by making the assumption about their faith and their ability to apply this part of their life, just because the pastor's mistake is well-intentioned doesn't make the damage any less severe. This happens when we explain the cross too quickly as a providential act of God. We do it because these folks, this is in the section called crosses for the members who are strong in their faith, right? That's who Joanne was talking about. We do that because these folks have walked closely with Jesus since they were born. They know that the man wasn't born blind in John 9 because of the sin of his parents. They've known it all their life. And so with what he hopes is a comforting and confident tone, the usually young pastor quotes the most overused passage in cross counseling. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. My friend Jessica was born into a Lutheran home, raised in church, in the catechism, and the word. She served as an integral member of several Welsh churches. She still bears the scars of a well-meaning pastor who quoted that passage to her when her little girl died. 20 years later, she still cries, not just at the thought of her child, but at the crisis of faith she had. Romans 8:28 is true. It was just the wrong time to say it. Seeing God's providential hand in taking a child home to heaven might just be a conclusion we can only fully draw when we are reunited with them in glory. Right? So I think that's one thing to be really careful of, is to try to take a cross that has come into somebody's life that you know, and immediately try to help them have perspective on it that might take them many, many years to have, right? I think letter D here is the best thing. Job, the man who had so much suffering in his life, his friends show up and they just sit and they weep with him. That's when they were at their best. Things started to fall apart when Job's friends tried to explain why this happened to him, right? And their rationale was, well, good things don't happen to bad things don't happen to good people, Job, so you've obviously done something wrong. Right? Yeah, so I guess my encouragement when you're talking about crosses or evil or suffering coming into somebody's life, maybe the Bible passage that I always share with people is, rather than trying to explain it away, I use that Bible passage from Isaiah where God's people thought that God had forgotten them. And he said, can a mother forget the baby at her breast? He says, I could never forget you. Your names are engraved on the palms of my hand. I mean, when our loved ones are going through some great suffering or catastrophe, what they need to hear is that God has their names engraved on his palms. That's it. God hasn't forgotten you. But I think don't try to explain it away. It is true that God will in all things work for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. Absolutely true. That's just maybe the wrong time to say it. For my friend Jessica, she'll nod her head with that in heaven when she's reunited with her little girl. Until then, that is always going to be something where she goes, God, I do not understand. I don't get it. And we have to be willing to let people say that, right? We do know, and here, somebody brought it up, the assumption that Epicurus line of questioning makes is that, is everything that we call evil, evil? Or can God use what is rightly called evil or disaster for good? And we said absolutely can. We showed that with Jesus on the cross. And sometimes God lets us see Romans 8:28 come true in our life. Like, I don't know, maybe you had a cancer diagnosis. It was the hardest thing you ever went through. But, 7 years later, you can look back and see what God did to you in your faith and did to you and your family. And you can say, you know what, even that cancer diagnosis, God used that for me. Here's the thing. God just doesn't promise to show us all those answers this side of heaven. Right? That's the important thing to know. There's no guarantee you get to know those answers this side of heaven. There is a guarantee, though, that in God's economy of salvation, there is a plan going on. It's like looking at a tapestry. Tapestry, right? The stitched big stitched pictures. You ever looked at the back side of a tapestry? Just knots and strings, it's a mess, right? In this life, on this side of heaven, we only get to see God's plan like the back side of a tapestry, right? And it's okay to sit with your friend and admit that right now their life looks like nothing but knots and strings. One day, they're going to get to walk around to the other side, see what God had intended in all of that. And in some way that is almost impossible to imagine, what God has in store for us is going to be made all the more great and glorious by the brokenness that we went through to get there. Other thoughts on that ordering of responses. All right, let's take a look at number 4. Evil and suffering isn't evidence against God. We talked about that for a minute before. Like, what can you do with evil? Take a look at philosopher Mackey there. This is kind of a dated argument. It's mostly discredited by most philosophers today, but a lot of skeptics still hang on to it. He says, if a good and powerful God exists, he would not allow pointless evil. Because there is much unjustifiable, pointless evil in the world, the traditional good and powerful God could not exist. Some other God or no God may exist, but not the traditional God. What's the flaw in the reasoning there? What's the flaw in the reasoning?
He's almost acknowledging that there is a true God. Like there's one traditional God and then all the other gods.
Okay, yeah, he's almost defining that there is one true God, and then there's other gods besides that. So again,
well, he's denying free will again. It says he would not allow pointless evil. In other words, you either allow it by free will or you determine everything that happens. There's, those are the two choices. So he says God will not allow that. Okay, so you're saying everything's predestined and preordained.
Yeah. Take a look at what C.S. Lewis writes down there. Again, C.S. Lewis, Oxford professor. He was a famous atheist who was brought to faith through the witness of the gospel by J.R.R. Tolkien of Lord of the Rings author. These guys were at the same university college together. After C.S. Lewis was brought to faith, he became a Christian apologist or defender and wrote books like Mere Christianity and the Chronicles of Narnia. He wrote in Mere Christianity, speaking about his past atheism. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Of course, I could have given up on my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too far, for the argument depended on saying that the world really was unjust, not simply that it didn't happen to please my private fancies. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. Right? That's an interesting quote there, right? He's saying that if I have the idea, he said in some other place, I wouldn't know what a crooked line was unless I saw a straight one. Right? This is the point he's making here. I can only call things unjust if I'm comparing it to some moral truth that I hold or that I think is universally held. Like, you know what, the law of tooth and fang should not be the way our counties here in south of Atlanta should be run. It should not be whoever has the biggest gun wins. No, I think people shouldn't be able to be killed just because somebody wants to take their stuff. It's unjust. Well, who says so? Plantinga. Could there really be anything such as horrifying wickedness if there were no God and we just evolved? I don't see how. There can be no such thing, or there can be such a thing only if there is a way that rational creatures are supposed to live, obliged to live. A secular way of looking at the world has no place for genuine moral obligation of any sort, and thus no way to say that there is such a thing as genuine and appalling wickedness. Accordingly, if you think there really is such a thing as horrifying wickedness, and not just an illusion, then you have a powerful argument for the reality of God. Yeah, so in fact, this modern Christian philosophers would say this question of Epicurus is actually not evidence against the existence of God, but is actually evidence for the existence of God. The fact that we think some things are universally wicked suggests that there is something that is universally good, that there is something by which we can judge actions. That they say is a powerful evidence for the existence of God. Or at least what you could say is, if you were a skeptic or an atheist, the problem of evil in the world doesn't go away if you reject the idea of a God. You still have to deal with the question, why is there evil and why do I consider it so? Please.
So it's kind of like the whole adage of like you have to have those moments of a cloudy sky in order to understand a sunny day. So
Yeah.
even when you're depressed, just remember that like it's going to clear up at some point. You can be happy again.
Yeah, that is another theodicy that people use, that we wouldn't know what it's like to be happy unless we knew sadness. We wouldn't know what it's like to be well-fed unless we were hungry. The atheist philosophers would counter that by saying, well, okay, if God had to have some level of privation or distress for humanity so that they might be able to recognize the good, well, then wouldn't an all-good and all-powerful God introduce the least amount of privation or distress possible if he was all true, all loving, and all good? Right? So that theodicy doesn't quite get us there. That privation thing. Ronald.
If I can, I would say that the philosopher Mackey there, he sort of views his statements as if he lives in like an ivory tower, his view of the world. And I don't mean that disrespectfully, I just mean he does it from like an isolated view, because he doesn't consider the people who come to know Christ. Because if you look at what the Bible teaches, it was the lowest of the struggle, it was the slaves, it was the women, it was the very poor, it was the people who suffered from leprosy, is the people who, so those people turned to God in joy. They still were in suffering, but they still turned into joy. So what was Christ fixing those people?
Well, yeah.
Wealthy or what?
Atheism and every other religion in the world doesn't do anything about it. But Christianity says this, that God cared so much about his suffering creatures, his suffering children, that what did he do? He descended into our brokenness. There's only one God in the entire pantheon of religions in this world that says God suffered with us. Only one. Only Christianity. Only where Jesus, or the Son of God, becomes incarnate and suffers for mankind. And that's a really important thing. This look at the italics underneath number 5. Albert Camus says this: Christ, the God-man, suffers too with patience. Evil and death can no longer entirely be imputed to him, since he suffers and dies. The night on Golgotha is so important in the history of man only because, in its shadows, the divinity ostensibly abandoned its traditional privilege and lived through to the end, despair included, the agony of death. Thus is explained the Lama Sabachthani, why have you forsaken me, and the frightful doubt of Christ in agony. So Tim Keller says, 2 things can happen when you suffer. One is you think, I'm being punished. But the cross says, no, Jesus took your punishment. The second question comes up, well, maybe God doesn't care. But the cross says God does care. He lost a child out of his love for you. The fact that we have a God who suffered with us meant that we have a God who actually wants to do something about the problem of evil or suffering in the world, as opposed to what the philosophers try to impute about him, that he is just a God who sits up there like he added evil and goodness into the world like a snow globe and shook it up and then watched to see what happened. You know, like a little boy with a magnifying glass, burning up ants. Instead, he entered into our brokenness. And the resurrection is the solution. Look at the last page. How about number 5? How does the Christian belief in the resurrection provide a resource for dealing with and understanding suffering, based on what we talked about before? What do you think? Doris?
Gives you hope
Yeah, it gives you hope of what?
of a better world to come.
Okay, of a better world to come. You look at the next question there. It says, Revelation 21 pictures, so at the end of time, it talks about the renewal and restoration of creation to the perfection with which God made it. This is something we have to remind ourselves again and again. Our ultimate goal is not to get to heaven. okay? Because heaven is not the end. The ultimate goal is to get to God's new creation where we'll be raised body and soul and live a flesh and blood life in a creation just like Eden, the way God made it at the beginning. Heaven is not the end, right? There's a reason every Sunday we confess faith in the resurrection of the dead. And when you die and we put your body in a coffin and your soul goes up to heaven with Jesus, that's not the end. That's kind of a waiting station on the way there. What God says, he's going to renew and restore this earth. Think of the evil or suffering that has impacted your life. What would it mean for it to be undone, repaired, your life restored? What the resurrection of all flesh says to every one of us who suffers is, just wait. Romans 8:28, God's going to keep it. He's going to keep that promise. We just don't get to say when. God promises to cure your cancer. He does not promise it right now. God promises to fix your broken relationships. He promises to give your dead back to you. He just doesn't promise it today. Robert.
This kind of points to the nature of God, even in the questions they're asking. If an all-powerful, if an all-knowing, well, in order to be an all-powerful and an all-knowing, there has to be a being that exists outside of our temporal understanding, outside of our physical manifestations by its requirement. And so then we're asking questions, if this being that is outside of our physics, out of our time, is real, why isn't he constrained by our time and our physics? It doesn't, the nature of God says that we can't understand this.
Yeah, so to summarize that a little bit, if we're asking the question, why is there evil in the world? First of all, that implies the fact that there's someone who would answer, right? That by itself is an argument for God. And then to try to take the God of the universe and constrain him to our timelines or to our physics, that's what Epicurus was doing. Well, there's evil. Can there be an all-powerful and all-good God, and can evil and suffering exist? Epicurus would say no. We with the Bible would say yes, for now, not forever, right? This is one of my favorite parts. Just after the climax of the trilogy of the Lord of the Rings, Samwise Gamgee discovers his friend Gandalf was not dead, as he thought, but alive. He cries, "I thought you were dead, but then I thought I was dead myself. Is everything sad going to come untrue?" The answer of Christianity to that question is yes. Everything sad is going to come untrue, and it will somehow be greater for having once been broken and lost. Embracing the Christian doctrines of the incarnation and cross brings profound consolation in the face of suffering, and the doctrine of the resurrection can instill us with a powerful hope. It promises that we will get the life we most long for, but it will be infinitely more glorious world than if there had never been the need for bravery, endurance, sacrifice, or salvation. The Russian author Dostoevsky, he wrote in The Brothers Karamazov, "I believe, like a child, that suffering will be healed and made up for, that all the humiliating absurdity of human contradictions will vanish like a pitiful mirage, and that in the world's finale, at the moment of eternal harmony, something so precious will come to pass that it will suffice for all hearts, for the comforting of all resentments, for the atonement of all the crimes of humanity, of all the blood that they've shed, that it will make it not only possible to forgive, but to justify all that has happened. This is the ultimate defeat of evil and suffering. It will not only be ended, but so radically vanquished that what has happened will only serve to make our future life and joy infinitely greater."
In heaven, there's no more pain, no more suffering. It almost sounds like we have to remember the pain and suffering to have that joy in heaven.
Joanne said if in heaven we don't have pain and suffering, in order to have that joy, we need to be able to remember the pain and suffering to have that joy? It's a good philosophical question. It also kind of brings up something interesting that I've read, and I think this is true. Do you know that you can't remember pain? I mean, you can remember about it. Like I remember when I broke my leg or I almost took off my finger, and I remember, boy, that was painful, but you can't remember the pain. You can remember that it was painful. Marie?
Otherwise, our population would be much less.
Excellent point, yes. That would be population control. So next week, we're going to take a look at the doubter's question. Christianity is just a straitjacket. It keeps me from doing the things that I want to do and keeps me from living life to the hilt. Next week, Sunday. Thank you, guys.